I want to bring Richard on. Richard Grove is one of my heroes. He's a forensic historian. I personally consider Richard to be one of the greatest minds of our time, and I will be forever grateful to him for empowering millions of other minds at this most critical time.
And when you get into today's story, you're going to see how the narrative that's unfolding is not new. It's kind of ancient. It needs to be updated. Let's go back to the history. On the left is the flag of the East India Company, the place that deals opium. On the right, you see the Grand Union flag of the United States. That's the first flag of America. Now, at that time, there was a lot of Eastern establishment people, rich families, call them the Boston Brahmins, call them the Eastern establishment, very, very close to this East India Company opium trade and slave trade. They wanted to create an Oxford for America. So it was gifted by this guy, Elihu Yale. Yale University is the Oxford for America. Elihu Yale was an official for the East India Company. And there's more ties to the opium in Yale than just Elihu Yale's money coming from that. There's that's another one of the undercurrents. I also wanted to point out the archives at Yale. You've got the British East India Company records. It's not like they keep those things in England. They keep them at Yale, the Oxford in America. The Order of Skull and Bones. Yale University is formed in 1832. In a couple slides, we'll get to what's the synchronicity of 1832. Why would this group show up at that Oxford in America in that year? It's pretty interesting. We'll get to it in a couple of slides. I wanted to point out that the way that Skull and Bones comes to prominence is there's this character in history called William Huntington Russell. He's the corporate founder of Skull and Bones and the Russell Trust, a tax-exempt foundation in 1856. Now, he's the descendant. The Russells are part of the Boston Brahmin families, these wealthy families. And though he wasn't personally in the opium trade, his cousin was doing that. That's where the money came from. By 1825, they saved the Bank of England, getting closer and closer. I mean, if the Bank of England can't survive without the Rothschilds, that's a pretty good sign. Influence, control, and a change in power. Not so much that they're competing, but like I said, they're going to be symbiotic and work to each other's needs here in a couple decades. Around this same time, there's an opium magnate. It's the Sassoon family, the Rothschilds of the East, according to this article on screen. This is formalized as David Sassoon and Company. This is a couple decades before the Sassoons marry into the Rothschild family. So I think it's David's grandson, Edward Albert Sassoon, who marries into the Rothschilds. We'll see in a couple of slides. By 1900, this is 2 years before Rhodes dies, the Rothschilds establish the Rhodes Scholarships. It reads, the Rothschilds first became associated with Rhodes in 1887 during his struggle with Barney Barnado for control of the diamond industry in South Africa. Cecil Rhodes died in he died in 1902, so there's a typo here. Nathaniel, first Lord Rothschild, was one of Rhodes' executors and was primarily responsible for using the fortune Rhodes left to establish the Rhodes Scholarships in his memory. William T. Stead is the person who helped Rhodes come up with the idea of creating a secret society to bring America back into the empire. They talk about it in this book. We're not going to have time to read all the quotes. I want you to know, here's the pages from that book. You can read them when you have time. This is talking about the creation of a secret society based on the Jesuits, but instead of the Catholics, they would replace British Empire. So they have a structure. And then on page 73, what an awful thought it is that if we had not lost America, or even now we could arrange with the present members of the United States Assembly and our House of Commons, the peace of the world is secured for all eternity. Around the same time as this British infiltration into America, the United States goes to war with Japan. Got 3,000. It's like a 9/11 out there in Hawaii, because they said 9/11 was like a new Pearl Harbor. So that was like their 9/11 of the day. Now, interestingly enough, the Standard Oil Rockefeller oil depots at Pearl Harbor for all those ships and planes, all that stuff untouched by the Japanese. Just saying. So the United States is at war with Japan. No one could have foreseen this. unless you're British intelligence running the spies who are planning the operation and not telling America at the same time. So John Cecil Masterman was a director of MI6, Military Intelligence Department 6, Section 6, for the Queen, or the King of England at that point. The double cross system in the War of 1939 and 1945 is Masterman's memoir. And in there, he says that they had an agent, that he had this questionnaire. He's working for the Japanese. Pearl Harbor would be the first point attacked, and plans for this attack had reached an advanced state by August 1941. Obviously, so this is MI6. They know all about it. They're running the spies that are doing it in Germany, in Japan. It's fascinating when you read what they wrote. Obviously, this is Masterman quoting. Obviously, it was for the Americans to make their appreciation and to draw their own deductions from the questionnaire rather than for us to do so. Nonetheless, with our fuller knowledge of the case and the man, we ought to have stressed its importance more than we did. With the greater experience of a few more years' work, we should certainly have risked a snub and pointed out to our friends in the United States what the significance of the document might be. But in 1941, we were still a little chary of expressing opinions and a little mistrustful of our own judgment, because they're saying they hadn't been working with American intelligence very long because they had just created the OSS at that point.
I want to bring Richard on. Richard Grove is one of my heroes. He's a forensic historian, which I think is perfect given the subtitle of today's investigation is Means, Motive, and Opportunity. I've asked him to help us solve the mystery of how Western education got destroyed. He's also a term that I would use for myself and quite a few people in this particular network. I consider him to be a comprehensivist. Bucky Fuller said, "We will not make it as a species unless there are sufficient comprehensivists." And that is people who are looking at the whole and not so specialized that they can't see what's really going on. So let me give you a short version of introduction to Richard. First of all, Richard, welcome. Just personally from me to you, thank you so much for honoring us with your presence today. How are you doing?
Thank you, Foster. Greetings, everybody. It's always good to hang out and talk about Bucky Fuller and comprehensive ideas about how the world might be working.
Oh, great. Well, I'll turn it over to you in a minute, but I want to talk a little bit about how you got here. The short version is Richard retired from corporate America in his early 30s after a short but very successful career when he became a corporate whistleblower in 2004 and represented himself in court. Good preparation for solving this mystery. Since then, Richard has dedicated his time and efforts to collecting the best and rarest artifacts and evidence with which to illustrate this ongoing corruption of justice in order to create and develop solutions to provide individuals with cognitive liberty. I love that phrase. We'll find out more about what that means, cognitive liberty. Richard teaches intellectual self-defense, methods for critical thinking, and creative problem solving. And he describes that as he widened his perspectives, he discovered a stream of systematic control systems permeating our culture. Within that stream, he found a current of corruption adversely affecting hardworking folks in the middle and lower classes. He saw that people are being dumbed down, and the thieves of freedom are plundering the production of those who are too ill-informed to protect themselves intellectually from such schemes. Richard sees freedom as being composed of three primary ingredients: non-aggression, physical self-defense, and intellectual self-defense. And he creates media really to educate and inform those who seek to understand how our world really works. I personally consider Richard to be one of the greatest minds of our time, and I will be forever grateful to him for empowering millions of other minds at this most critical time. So I am honored to welcome and turn over the talking stick to Richard Grove.
Thank you, Foster. I'm honored by the invitation, and I'm inspired by so many people here to hear the story. I mean, we're talking about the evolution of consciousness. The only war that I've seen as a forensic historian that's ever been waged in human history is the war to suppress consciousness, and it's waged against those who seek to express consciousness. You can go back to the time of Plato and Pythagoras all the way up to today. It's a current trend. Look at how much censorship is going on today. And is the censorship reflective of misinformation, malinformation, disinformation, or is it just inconvenient to the narrative that they want everybody to believe? The aspects we're going to talk about later in the talk today about schooling, it's made to make people think and react and behave in a similar manner, because in the problem of human control, humans are feisty beings to control, especially if they have freedom and liberated minds. So the establishment has been working diligently to dumb people down, to make you have like a shorter memory span than you need to take in the entire story, to start to decrypt it and make it meaningful in life. So what I have prepared, what I've whipped up especially for you guys today, is a brand new presentation, and it's a timeline. So this timeline, I'm not supposed to give you all the details. I'm pointing out historical events and artifacts that exist for you to check out on your own afterwards. We give you the links and the source materials and everything that we have together that's made this presentation. So you guys, it's more of a, this thing exists, you have access, dig into it while you can, while we still have internet connections and we can still speak semi-freely and exchange research and information about the big picture. Because I too am a fan and student of Buckminster Fuller. And one of the things he said is don't fight forces, learn to use them. And you can't, you can't end this tyranny by, fighting it directly. You have to make something better that makes it obsolete. So it's no longer necessary. And when you get into today's story, you're going to see how the narrative that's unfolding is not new. It's kind of ancient. It needs to be updated. It's not to be updated by they, them, those that we're going to talk about. That's the Great Reset. We have to kind of take it upon ourselves to reinstill these aspects of education, to come up to speed with what's going on. And then everyone formulate your own agenda for the future using information that reflects that which actually exists, instead of what people are being brainwashed and indoctrinated with through mainstream media and education. So with that, education, you started with a definition. My definition for education is learning how to ask substantial questions, find reasonable answers that reflect things that exist in reality. And if you can learn how to do that, you can follow your capacity for curiosity and go about anywhere in the world. And all these books and artifacts and all the things that I've been in the midst of for the past 20 years, it came as a function of a mixture of incredulity. I didn't believe these things could go on because I had an education. They would have told me about this. And my curiosity. These things are going on. No one's talking about them. What are the artifacts? What's the evidence? And today we're going to dig into this timeline. I'm going to give you a brief overview of what I call the underground history of America. And we'll get to why I call it that later in the lecture. But let's unfold. Let's get it started. All right, if I click this and I click this, we should be able to move forward. Today's discussion, because we're going to talk afterwards, I'm excited for that. Education from tyranny to liberation, the means, motive, and opportunity. In my translation, that's the who, the why, and the how. So we're going to cover the who and the why, and then the third part of the presentation, we'll get to the how. Moving forward, I have 93 podcast episodes on the topic we're going to talk about today. Not to distract you right now, but if you want to dig in, find the history, find the source materials, find the links. I've done a lot of good work for you ahead of time, and that will be linked in the next part here. The best podcast you've never heard, the Grand Theft World podcast, is what I'm currently hosting. So Peace Revolution was my prior podcast. This is my current podcast. This is current events. This is a weekly distillation of censored news for the past week, whereas Peace Revolution is the history that drives the news in the first place. So people need the history. Peace Revolution, you want this week's news in digest form, Grand Theft World podcast. The story of the controlled demolition of America in 3 acts is what we're going to discuss. The motive, the British conquest of America since 1776, and it really culminated in 1902 when that plan ceased and they had control. The means, the British partnership with the Rothschild financial dynasty, 1814 to present, and the opportunity to collaborate about the end of American sovereignty from the inside out through corrupting education and introducing schooling, or what I would call forced indoctrination, state-sponsored indoctrination. And by the way, because I'm not just sharing through Zoom, I'm using my broadcaster, I should be able to pop back like this and make commentary where I can't do that easily within the Zoom share your screen type thing. So, as a for instance, let's go back to this for a second. This indoctrination, I have a buddy, Tom Woods, he said, you should always start with a joke. What's the difference between the government and the mafia? The mafia doesn't have a 12-year indoctrination system to convince you that they're not the mafia. And with that, that's an unplanned, spur of the moment, apropos to the story we're going to learn about right now, the gangsters who might have gotten themselves in front of your children over the years. The people who designed the indoctrination system have a history that goes back before the even founding of America. So we're going to start with the East India Company, the British East India Company, a private corporation that went around the world, started in 1600 under, I think, Queen Elizabeth I. It was formed to trade in the Indian region, initially in the East Indies and later with the Qing dynasty in China. So here's a couple photographs. I'm sorry, these are a couple paintings from museums, photographs that I put into the presentation for you. Various cultures being introduced to the British way of life by way of the East India Company. Now, here's the problem. There was a lot of slave cotton in the colonies, and these cotton pieces went over to Manchester, England. They were formed into textiles. They were brought to India. This is where you see these warehouses of opium. The textiles were traded for opium. And then the East India Company would take that opium over to China. And we're going to see a large wealth exchange in a moment between the East and West based on the East India Company's subjugation of Asia to opium monopoly. The EIC, East India Company, mastering wealth distribution through opium and slave goods. This is a key aspect of how the British Empire became the global empire that the United States fought against. The East India Company in England, 1600 to 1873, 273-year dynasty. They basically took over the Mughal dynasty of opium. So I pulled a quote for you guys. During the same time in India, the Mughal dynasty was extensively growing opium poppy and doing profitable trade with China and East Asia. This trade was a large source of revenue for the Mughal dynasty. As the downfall of the Mughal dynasty started in 1658, the British, through the East India Company, took over the major cultivation and production of opium. Now, more recently in history, the United States military has been in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is famous for opium and poppy production. It's not the first endeavor of America being there. The British fought 3 wars in Afghanistan over the opium poppy during the time of the East India Company. So it's kind of like America has become the property managers for the British Empire. That might tie into the story we're learning about today as well. So there's a continuity, an ominous continuity, as John Taylor Gatto would say, of this opium production, the wealth that comes with it, the power that comes with it, and the people who are in control of it. Might be the same people who are in control of your education system. We'll find out later. First, I got to take you back to 1753. These are top countries by GDP. Up at the top, you see China. Right below that, the big green line, that's the Mughal Empire. This is 1753. I'm going to move one slide forward. Take a look at these 2 top lines. Oh, you see that? 1758. That's the East India Company now. Look at that. What's going to happen from here, kids? Well, it would be long to take you through year by year, so let's jump 100 years into the future. 1758 to 1857. 100 years later, British East India Company still holding it down. You see the United States right below the EIC, and right below that is the United Kingdom. So it's not just the East India Company. It's the fact that the East India Company's GDP was so far larger than its home, the United Kingdom, mostly because it took over the Mughal opium empire. A lot of money in that. So here we are in 1857, 100 years into the East India Company's opium production. By the time you get to 1859, they say East India Company is not a good idea. Let's call this the British Raj and pretend it's in charge of India. So now the GDP is no longer East India Company. It turns into the British Raj, 1859. There you see the United Kingdom still a couple slots down below what the East India Company's wealth and wealth engine, let's call it that, has produced. By 1881, just after the United States Civil War, the United States has surpassed in GDP even the British Raj front of the East India Company. And as we go forward into 1890, you see the United States surpass China with the old East India Company, British Raj right behind it. And then it just changes over a couple of years. And this is just a flash forward into World War II. Look at that. How has that changed over time? And what happened to the United States? I mean, we're great. We got a lot of inventions here, hardworking people, but what maybe happened? We're going to learn a little bit about that because the East India Company and the British Empire is one of three characters we're going to learn about in today's story. There you see by 2018, the United States had to even surpass China and Japan, but you see China catching up. Let's go back to the history. On the left is the flag of the East India Company, the place that deals opium. On the right, you see the Grand Union flag of the United States. That's the first flag of America. Now, at that time, there was a lot of Eastern establishment people, rich families, call them the Boston Brahmins, call them the Eastern establishment, very, very close to this East India Company opium trade and slave trade. So maybe the early colonists were like, hey, maybe we should still be able to, take our boats over to Canton, because that's what the Astors who traded their furs. I mean, it started as an island called Canton, but then that's the stronghold off the coast of China for the East India Company to pour opium into China for 100 years. They called it the century of humiliation. So there were still American colonists who want to fly, take their ship over there and fill it up with opium and bring it back. They brought back from reading these ships' manifests, tons, like 20 tons a time. Some of them were privateers and getting caught after the separation of the United States from the United Kingdom. But the similarity, I would argue, is so you can continue to trade with a partner who doesn't notice the subtle differences, and they see your privateer English, like your American East Coast ship, coming in, and it looks just like an East India Company ship, and they know what you're there to trade for. So there's this bond, if you will, between the big wealth of the East Coast families and the British Empire that survived the revolution. It survived the Constitution. So early on in America's history, there was an Oxford University is a 1,000-year-old university. It's the heart of the British Empire, and the future of the British Empire is trained there. They wanted to create an Oxford for America. So it was gifted by this guy, Elihu Yale. Yale University is the Oxford for America. Elihu Yale was an official for the East India Company. And there's more ties to the opium in Yale than just Elihu Yale's money coming from that. There's that's another one of the undercurrents. I also wanted to point out the archives at Yale. You've got the British East India Company records. It's not like they keep those things in England. They keep them at Yale, the Oxford in America. The Order of Skull and Bones. Yale University is formed in 1832. In a couple slides, we'll get to what's the synchronicity of 1832. Why would this group show up at that Oxford in America in that year? It's pretty interesting. We'll get to it in a couple of slides. I wanted to point out that the way that Skull and Bones comes to prominence is there's this character in history called William Huntington Russell. He's the corporate founder of Skull and Bones and the Russell Trust, a tax-exempt foundation in 1856. Now, he's the descendant. The Russells are part of the Boston Brahmin families, these wealthy families. And though he wasn't personally in the opium trade, his cousin was doing that. That's where the money came from. So the acquisition of these, the Perkins family was another opium producing. The history of American opium families is fascinating because you might have seen some of their relatives become presidents. So to understand the power and the currency traded at that level in such amounts is really telling where these robber barons come from a little bit later in the 1800s. So that's the gist. It's Skull and Bones, Russell Trust Association, at Yale University, the Oxford in America, has opium money underpinning not only the building of the university, and Yale's role in it. It's also secret societies that may have yielded many U.S. statesmen and presidents from there. At this point, we want to break away from the East India Company and the opium, and we want to learn about this family called the Rothschild international family banking dynasty. It's a big family. There are many countries. Let's learn a little bit, not rumor, not innuendo. Let's learn some facts. Let's look at some artifacts. Let's learn the underground history of America. Now, part of today's conversation is means, motive, and opportunity. British Empire has motive, but they didn't have the means. The means doesn't come together purposefully. It's two groups following individual agendas who decide to basically swap problems later in the 1800s. It's a very interesting situation. We're going to get into it. The means, the Rothschild family dynasty. The sources I am using for this presentation come exclusively from the RothschildArchive.org, the family archive. And then I've also given you a guide to the archive so you can learn how to navigate it yourself. Pretty interesting, right? We're going to start with this character in the fancy dress. His name's George III. He's king of England at the time of the American colonists' revolution. He has a problem. First, he doesn't have enough troops. The troops are spread out. They got a big empire they're maintaining. They got East India Company. They got a whole bunch of stuff going on. America's an inconvenient problem, an unplanned problem, you might say. So what's he going to do? Well, he gets the benefit of bringing over soldiers who don't speak English. They're going to speak German. They're going to be real rough. They're going to be professional mercenaries. They're going to speak German. They're going to intimidate the English settlers, the nascent Americans, and get them back in line. He calls his cousin, this guy, Wilhelm IX, the Landgrave of Hesse Castle. He was later Elector Wilhelm I. So this is coming from the Royal Collection Trust. This is the British royal family's collection of artifacts. They, thoughtfully enough, have a photograph of a painting for this presentation. So you can see Wilhelm IX. Here he is again. Now you might find it interesting. His mother was Princess Mary. He's George III's cousin. So even though he's a Prussian elector of Hesse, we don't really understand what that means. What is a Landgrave? These sort of things. You just need to know he's George III's cousin, and he's sending Prussian soldiers. And if George III hadn't sent Hessian Prussian soldiers over to America, the following history of this family would be much different, because the Rothschilds' claim to fame was that they were the banker for William IX, King George III's cousin. So he's sending all this gold over to William of Hesse. He's got all this English gold. And in a few minutes, we're going to see what happens. You got George Washington. This is the American Revolution kicking off. He needs his Hessian soldiers. Here's the Rothschild archive that we're going to dig into and get the rest of the information for today's presentation. Specifically, I'm pointing you toward this public-facing page because they've got a great timeline. The history of the family in their own words, in the timeline. What a great place to dig into some artifacts and evidence. So the timeline starts way back in 1450. We don't need to go back that far. What we're looking at is the Hesse Castle, the Wilhelm IX, the cousin of George III, his connection. His business expanded rapidly following the French Revolution when Rothschild handled payments from Britain to hire the Hessian mercenaries. So this is from the Rothschilds' family history page in their archive. That's where the money came from. Okay, great. Let's move forward. There's the Hessian soldiers. They get sent over to America. They still lose. But over in Europe, meanwhile, you've got the Napoleonic Wars. Now, that same Wilhelm IX that has all that gold from King George III for those Hessian soldiers, he's scared when Napoleon comes and he's the scourge of Europe and he's in Prussia and he's going to, alleviate the Wilhelm of his gold. So Wilhelm says, I would like to be your first client, Rothschild. Until then, he was a court money exchanger, a court factor. He says, I want you to move some money. I want you to hide some money for me. So under Rothschild clients on the Rothschild archive, they expressly tell the whole story of how Wilhelm IX puts his money in his inheritance from his dad, who had also made money with the British, all into Meyer Amschel Rothschild's hands, who sends it to his son and Nathan in London, and Nathan invested over like the next 10 years. So that is the official start of the Rothschild family fortune, right? Nathan invested 500,000 pounds of the elector's funds in British government securities and bullion in 1806. Now, this bullion investment, they start dealing in bullion a few years later. You can see there on the timeline. My question was, as a researcher, on what date and time did the Rothschilds give the money back to Wilhelm IX after Napoleon split, right? And that war goes on to like 1814, I thought it went on. But according to this painting, it must have ended in 1812 because that's when Amschel Meyer de Rothschild had passed away. This also comes from the Royal Collection Trust. This is from the British royal family's personal artifacts. This is the visit of Wilhelm I. That's Wilhelm IX before he's the elector. When he was a Landgrave, he was Wilhelm IX. When he's the elector, he's William I. They changed his name. Elector of Hesse to Amschel Meyer de Rothschild, who lived from 1744 to 1812. Well, around that time of 1812, I have found no record in the Rothschild archives, in the family archives, anywhere of when and how that happened. The only evidence that they ever paid Wilhelm I back are these two paintings by the same author. So in this first painting, the chest of gold is on the ground, and there's also looks like a soldier with a chest of gold. In the next one, Wilhelm I is seated, and somebody in the right-hand corner is walking away with a box of coins, right? So these are two different paintings of the same scene. Remember, there's no other paper history of this, but in the Royal Collection Trust, they have these two paintings. Who did these paintings belong to? They're given by Leopold de Rothschild to Queen Mary in 1910. So this is like, hey, we're good for that. We didn't keep that guy's money. We have returned it, and we paid him interest. And there's a whole story to it. And you can see it in the description. You guys are also going to have a copy of these slides. It's in the Freedom Vault. So you can actually read into all these various things, click into them. I want you to know they're there, and I want you to get the general timeline. By 1814, the Battle of New Orleans, this is after British invade. 1812, they burned down the White House. By 1814, Andrew Jackson is the guy at the Battle of New Orleans who pushes the British off. And militarily, it's the last time Britain tries to conquer America. They decide to come up with another strategy for the same goal. So after 1814, things get real quiet here in the United States with the British because they go around the world. They mess with China and India for most of the 1800s. We're going to get into how that all unfolds. By 1814, the Rothschild supplied gold to Wellington. This is so he can defeat Napoleon. And there's this whole controversy of stock trading and British government getting the news and who got the news first. They say it happened with strong family ties and an unsurpassed communications network. That's how they were able to pull off not only funding, moving gold to Wellington in the Pyrenees in Spain, but also to get news of Napoleon's defeat, which no one else believed because they didn't know the Rothschilds had a courier pigeon network, which would have made it a lot more believable. Here's the next part. Rothschilds in Pigeon Post. Here it talks about the family's proclivity for using carrier pigeons, as some might call them. Now, that's interesting because with this network of carrier pigeons, they become like the FedEx of their day. So much so that Queen Victoria and Prince Albert use the Rothschild courier network exclusively, and that once the telegraph comes along, the Reuters group that was using courier pigeons and leveraging Rothschild then start using telegraph, and Rothschild start using telegraph. I just want you to know you can go to the Rothschild archive, learn about the pigeon post that might have provided information quicker than by horse or swimming across the English Channel. 1818, you got the first major business loan of the Rothschilds. They loan it to the crushed Prussian government. So Napoleon came through, crushed it. They're like a couple years afterwards, they're like, here's a 5% loan. They made gangbusters money on this. So this helps to propel the momentum of the Rothschilds family, who at that time were singularly focused on pretty much the British Empire. They're in 5 countries, at that point. The 5 sons have moved out, set up banks in the 5 countries. But a lot of the activities are used to support the rise of the family within Great Britain. You'll see them take over the Bank of England in a minute, the Royal Mint, get peerage, and then be at basically the same level as the royals in the Britain. As far as France, they had also climbed the ladder quite a bit. They shut down in Germany, they shut down in Italy. So they kind of, spread out and then focused on a couple strategic goals. And as we get into the mid 1820s rather, I was looking to see if there were Rothschild financials, because there's a lot of East India Company opium going on right now. And there's privatized Scottish joints that are doing it, like Jardine Matheson and Jardine Fleming is later. So there's companies today like Jardine Fleming that are the reminiscent pieces, the remnants of these opium magnates of the 1800s, like Jardine Matheson. So East India Company is backed up by privatized people that are helping them, plus all these banks that are helping them move the wealth around. And the Rothschilds didn't have anything to do with it that early in the 1820s, but they did start an insurance company that started to insure all these activities. So before financing it, we'll see that exploration in the China in a couple minutes, they started to go through and insure the ships. Ships sink, these sort of things. So there was a betting, that's what insurance kind of is. So by 1824, they set up the Alliance Assurance Company, which today is the RSA group of insurance companies that still exists. By 1825, they saved the Bank of England, getting closer and closer. I mean, if the Bank of England can't survive without the Rothschilds, that's a pretty good sign. Influence, control, and a change in power. Not so much that they're competing, but like I said, they're going to be symbiotic and work to each other's needs here in a couple decades. Around this same time, there's an opium magnate. It's the Sassoon family, the Rothschilds of the East, according to this article on screen. This is formalized as David Sassoon and Company. This is a couple decades before the Sassoons marry into the Rothschild family. So I think it's David's grandson, Edward Albert Sassoon, who marries into the Rothschilds. We'll see in a couple of slides. But the point is, he's known as the Opium King of Baghdad. He was the treasurer for the Turkish governor of Baghdad. He's in control of the opium monopoly. It says David Sassoon and Company with branches in Calcutta, Shanghai, Canton, and Hong Kong, and his business, which included a monopoly of the opium trade, extended as far as Yokohama, Nagasaki, and other cities in Japan. So now there's East India Company opium that is being brought in through David Sassoon and his organization. Oddly enough, in that same year, 1832, you've got this secret society at Yale that, East India Company opium monopoly insertion into America, this Oxford of America. You've got this Skull and Bones group, and they were funded by people in the opium monopoly. So by the time we get down to 1838, that's the earliest Rothschild trade with China, right before the British Opium War. So they set up in Ceylon. They start growing these fine teas. There's a whole bunch of interesting things that go on. But this is just building up to what's going on with the British Empire and their financiers while they're not playing with America during these odd years during the 1800s, because it's going to come back together with a solid plan by the end of this century. By 1849, you've got gold in California. And so you have an establishment of a Rothschild agency in San Francisco. Most people don't know about this. The discovery of gold in California in 1848 had awakened Rothschild interest, and in 1849, N.M. Rothschild established an agency in San Francisco in the persons of 2 Rothschild agents, Benjamin Davidson and John May. I wonder what they created. There must be a bank that they created. It doesn't say here. The connection persisted until the impact of the gold rush had diminished. So part of what the gold rush is the collection of gold. But in the slide, you're going to see how, I'll just go to the Royal Mint, 1852. I'll jump ahead a couple years. I'll go back. The establishment of the Royal Mint refinery. So they're collecting the gold, and then they're processing and minting the gold. And in order to do that, they had to take over a mercury mine in a couple different places for the refinement. It's an interesting process, but I just wanted to show continuity. They don't just save the bank. They find the gold, then they mint the gold. And he who controls the gold makes the rules, I was once told. That's not how it's supposed to be. That's not the real golden rule. 1850, London Bank uses the new communication services of Reuters. So heretofore, Reuters carrier pigeons turned into a telegraph system. Wonder where they got that. In 1850, Reuters approached the Rothschilds, seeking them as a client for his new services. So while this was a private thing they did for their clients, the Reuters offering is do this for general business, to have a front out there that does this. This is interesting today because I think it's the guy from the chairman of Reuters is on the board of directors of Pfizer. So these companies didn't wane in power over the years. They've gained in power over the years. They've continued to live and evolve and survive world wars. It's very interesting to see the evolution. By 1852, they're openly advisors to royalty, including handling, like I said, their private mail, doing a courier system, perfectly safe and very quick. The Queen described their services. That's her testimonial. So by this time, 1852, America is not in the Civil War yet. The Rothschilds are very close to the British royalty at this point. The Royal Mint Refinery, I just mentioned that. There's also this curious book. It's not in the Rothschild archive, but it is in the timeline. It's called The Revival of Israel, The Last Nationalist Question by Moses Hess. He was a French socialist. He's not part of the British Empire, but he had this plan, and it gained a lot of steam. Part of that plan was a plan for detailing the creation of Israel and listing Freemasonry, the Rothschilds, and others. I know it sounds really far out. He wrote it in 1862. I have a copy of the book. It's kind of far out. It's kind of a wacky plan. But, and that plan, I don't think was carried out, but it inspired Theodor Herzl and Chaim Weizmann and other people, and Cecil Rhodes, other people who were around these political ideas. By the way, within 10 years of him writing this book, the Rothschilds began colonization of Palestine. Here around 1860, from the Royal Collection Trust, is James Mayer de Rothschild, is Baron de Rothschild. He sent a photograph because these guys were all early. They had a photography club. Lionel Rothschild was into autochromes, which is a way of taking a picture on a piece of glass, and then there's a mirror, and it gives you like this almost holographic iPad type feel to it. A lot of interesting things I don't have time to talk about because we're getting to, in America, we had the civil disruption, political assassination. This has nothing to do with the people in power that I was just talking about, as far as the people who might not want America to be successful and thrive. Anyway, the play was called My American Cousin. Continuing on, Rothschilds in Palestine. That's where we're at. Baron Edmund de Rothschild in Palestine. They start colonizing in like the 1870s. So right after the American Civil War, this is going on overseas. One of the groups that they used as a front group for colonization in Palestine in the late 1800s was called Erlanger and Company, which is like a Paris banking house or a German banking house. I forget which. And it sticks in my memory because there was an accusation during the Civil War that the Rothschilds were funding the Confederacy because of the dependence on slave cotton and all these sort of things in that system that the British had. And it was stricken down. And the Rothschild comment was, that wasn't us. It was a Christian banking house down the street. It was Erlanger. And he wrote it off like they have nothing to do with that firm. When you look at the full history, the comprehensive history, you'd see Erlanger all over the place as a front group for colonization and works that the Rothschilds didn't want their name on directly. So there's that as well. So this part of the archive describes the proto-colonization of Palestine to create the future state of Israel. Right around this time, 1875, Lionel de Rothschild helps the British government buy the Suez Canal. So another piece of empire building that the British government's like, hey, we'd like to do this, but we can't. Can you help us out? He's like, sure. So they control the Suez Canal, which is pretty much control of trade to Asia and the Middle East. And it's a very key element on the geopolitical map that they are drawing at that time. By the way, Disraeli's the prime minister that Lionel de Rothschild helped to buy the Suez Canal. Disraeli's famous for saying, the world is governed by very different personages from what is imagined by those who are not behind the scenes. He's good buddies with all the people doing it. So he's Johnny on the spot. He's one to know. Interesting quote. Here's another person that Americans know. This is Andrew Carnegie. What they don't know is that in 1886, he wrote a book called Triumphant Democracy, or The 50 Years March of the Republic. Now, this is a book, this is like one of the first flares that goes up, that it's like Anglo-Americanism revived. It had kind of, waned in the middle of the 1800s. By 1886, he's setting up a flare. He says, hey, America and Britain should be rejoined. How does he say it? Well, he says it in a very Andrew Carnegie way. He says it, let men say what they will. I say that as surely as the sun is in the heavens once shone upon Britain and America united, so surely is it one morning to rise, to shine upon, to greet again the reunited states, the British American Union. Wow, that's interesting. They don't tell you that when he's setting up libraries throughout America. They don't tell you that when he's got an international endowment for world peace. There's an agenda behind it, and it's not about philanthropy, kids. Same year, 1886, the Jekyll Island Club. It's an Anglo-American robber baron hangout, the most elite establishment club in the world of its type. It's one of the first transatlantic phone call. I think it was in on the first transatlantic phone call about that. So there's now a place in America, and it's still there today. G. Edward Griffin had his Red Pill conference there, I think, last year. Jekyll Island, and it's the then time playground of the most elite and wealthy movers and shakers in the world. And it was an Anglo-American establishment. It wasn't just some Americans with some ideas. It wasn't just some British people. They had continued to have cohesion despite it being 110 years past the American Revolution. This is continuity of a goal unfolding. So around 1886 in the Rothschild timeline on their archive, you see the Rothschild Frere, the French Rothschild brothers, they develop interests in Russian oil. So let me break this down for you. There is this family, I think it was three brothers, called the Nobel family. And they were the early Rockefellers of their day in oil. They invented the oil tanker, the oil car. What most people don't know is that the Nobel, enterprise, which, created TNT and then also the Nobel Peace Prize, they were financed by the Rothschilds. So the Rothschilds started in banking, got into oil. The Rockefellers in America started in oil, got into banking. As you're going to see right around this time, those two families say, hey, we got similar things going on. How about world domination? It's going to unfold here in just a second. Also at this point in 1886, 1887, that's when Sir Edward Albert Sassoon of the Opium Dynasty formally marries into the Rothschild family. So now you've got interesting family connections that also tie into the East India Company connections. Now let's look at colonization of South Africa here in 1887. The Rothschilds financed the establishment of De Beers diamond mines. And by that, they have a protege in South Africa called Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes, under the leadership of Rothschild and financial backing of Rothschild, kind of amalgamates all these little mining operations down there to create De Beers Consolidated Mines, which until a couple years ago was a cartel that could not trade in America. They're the same people that convince people that a diamond is forever, that a clear, worthless stone at that time could be, equated to love, which is kind of ironic. They came up with the branding campaigns in the mid 1900s, like 1930, 1940. They got the British royal family, instead of wearing jewels of like rubies and emeralds and sapphires, they're like, wear diamonds, and they put them in Hollywood movies and sophisticated campaigns to market a product that they used a lot of slave labor for down there. They fought the Boer War, which was Lord Milner's first war. We're going to learn about Lord Milner's second war in a couple minutes, but this is just the setting up of the De Beers empire, orchestrated by Cecil Rhodes, financed by the Rothschild family in 1887. Now, there's Rhodes drawn as the Colossus who could straddle Africa, and he was planning a Cape to Cairo railway that would be like the crown jewel in the British Empire. So he was an empire builder. He was educated at Oxford under the philosophy of John Ruskin. He wanted to see an English-speaking world, and very much the same thing that Andrew Carnegie just elaborated upon. He was a Freemason, and he kind of brought together a plan that took a lot of agendas and put them together. And people said, that's good enough for us. And they have, since his death, moved forward with that plan, aimed it at America, been highly successful, and are very instrumental in creating the institutions we see today. So even though Rhodes never did the Cape to Cairo railway, it was his secret society, his scholarships, his legacy that drove most of 20th century political agendas as far as the West is concerned. Now, there's this quote from a book I'll show it to you in a couple minutes, but when Oxford men say, adapting Kipling, Oxford makes us we. What they mean is that we owe to Oxford friendships and intellectual understanding that sprang up in their minds and spirits because they met in a congenial society. So they're creating cultural imperialism. The Oxford in America, Yale, is supposed to groom future empire builders, just like they do in the home country, in the motherland, in the mothership of the 1,000-year university, Oxford. Kipling, by the way, he's Rhodes' best buddy. They're both Freemasons and builders of empire. A lot of interesting things you could learn from Kipling that we don't have time. Oh, look, we do have time. Kipling wrote this poem, 1898, called The White Man's Burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need. He's encouraging in this poem Uncle Sam in America to get on board with his empire building, to leave the Monroe Doctrine behind and get into international excursions for the purposes of spreading freedom and liberty all over the world. The British Empire figured out it couldn't take over the world with its current brand, and they rebranded as, hey, let's spread liberty and democracy around the world. In the United States, you should do it with us. You see? But 100 years earlier, they couldn't fight us militarily. They came up with a philosophy that was palatable and trickled down to the American people, not knowing the whole story. They buy into it. Kipling's poem is there to inspire U.S. imperialism. Kipling's, like I said, very close with Rhodes. And Kipling's early in the line of children's book writers, along with, among British spies. Ian Fleming, Roald Dahl were later spies that infiltrated America during World War II. Kipling was one of the earlier ones. By 1900, this is 2 years before Rhodes dies, the Rothschilds establish the Rhodes Scholarships. It reads, the Rothschilds first became associated with Rhodes in 1887 during his struggle with Barney Barnado for control of the diamond industry in South Africa. Cecil Rhodes died in he died in 1902, so there's a typo here. Nathaniel, first Lord Rothschild, was one of Rhodes' executors and was primarily responsible for using the fortune Rhodes left to establish the Rhodes Scholarships in his memory. So whether or not this is 1900 or 1902, Rhodes definitely died in 1902. This could be a typo because there is a missing C in Cecil there. Opportunity. The merger of motive and means to global power. This puts America in the crosshairs of the Anglo-American establishment. The Anglo-American establishment would be the Eastern establishment families whose money came from the opium, the British Empire, and their joint financiers who bail them out and proliferate the financing for empire building for the purposes of world domination, or at least, as you'll see, to get World War I, to get America into World War I. 1902, the last will and testament of Cecil John Rhodes, with elucidatory notes to which are added some chapters describing the political and religious ideas of the testator. That's Rhodes. This is edited by Rhodes' good buddy, William T. Stead. William T. Stead is the person who helped Rhodes come up with the idea of creating a secret society to bring America back into the empire. They talk about it in this book. We're not going to have time to read all the quotes. I want you to know, here's the pages from that book. You can read them when you have time. This is talking about the creation of a secret society, based on the Jesuits, but instead of the Catholics, they would replace British Empire. So they have a structure. And then on page 73, what an awful thought it is that if we had not lost America, or even now we could arrange with the present members of the United States Assembly and our House of Commons, the peace of the world is secured for all eternity. See how they want to use world peace, and by dominating the world and preventing anyone from rebelling, that's their brand of world peace. In order to do that, they need America. America hasn't wanted to play with them for like 100 years. They're trying to figure out how to get us back into the empire. So there's various quotes throughout the last will and testament. British Empire being the goal, America being the target. 1902, same year Rhodes died. This is the Evening Post. There's an article published talking very similarly. Mr. Cecil Rhodes advocated an imperial customs union. Lord Rothschild said, a customs union is possible for the English-speaking race. It is not possible for the British Empire. Whereas, if the empire and the republic were to form one customs union, the free trade area within the union would be sufficiently large enough to compensate for the economic loss occasioned by the imposition of duties upon territories which lay outside the union. Right? So they're mixing the ideas. They're putting them in front of people through the newspaper. Here's some more. Rhodes left money for the scholarships, which the Rothschilds administrated through Oxford. Then you see Rhodes scholars in the media that's controlled by that network. So this is just an example. This is 1951 Chicago Tribune. Left-hand column, Rhodes's ideas find fertile ground in the United Nations. Scholars advance British schemes. Also take note of the cartoon of the time in the middle. If we go to another example, same left column, scholars help British cash in on U.S. billions. Rhodes men hold key dole jobs. So during the time of McCarthyism, the Rhodes scholars, the British presence, the British infiltration of our society wasn't being questioned. It was being clapped for. So right around the same time, not as the newspaper articles, but as the same time as the Rhodes scholarships are kicking off, there are these lectures given at Columbia University in 1926 by someone who was on Cecil Rhodes's roundtable, the secret society that was there to control the English-speaking idea and bring America back into the empire. These lectures are published. You can read them. This is a couple of screen captures about bringing Oxford in and what role the Rhodes scholarships from Oxford play in anglicizing Americans, ameliorating them to the British Commonwealth's new ideas of world domination. And then you see, currently, Council on Foreign Relations. Richard Haas, the guy who runs it, he's a Rhodes Scholar. And there's Hillary Clinton. She's married to a Rhodes Scholar, Bill Clinton. Bill Clinton's mentor, his teacher, was a guy named Carroll Quigley from Georgetown University, professor of foreign service at the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. And we'll hear about his book upcoming in this presentation. This is one of my first memes. This is Cecil Rhodes here. I made my fortune on the back of slaves in South Africa and created apartheid. In 1902, I left my fortune to create the Rhodes Scholarships and a secret society to undermine America and bring it back into the British Empire. 114 years later, my goals remain unopposed because Americans don't read and my acolytes own their mass media outlets. My name is Cecil Rhodes. He's a gangster. Around that time of 1902 and his death, there's an Anglo-American formalized society that comes about. It's called the Pilgrims Society. See the American eagle riding on it back with the British Empire there. What's the white horse? Are we supposed to behold that? Or I don't know. But there's symbolism there. At the bottom, there's some Latin. It reads here, there, and everywhere. Wonder what they're all about. Here's some of the characters. This is King Edward and his empire builders. But if you break down this picture, you see some very interesting things. For instance, if we zoom into the back of this picture, we see King Edward and his empire builders. The guy behind King Edward is General Lord Roberts. He's the first president of that Pilgrim Society, founded July 11th, 1902. And if we zoom back out, the teal color on the left, these are Pilgrim Society people. And on the right, you've got people that are inside of MI6, the intelligentsia, if you will. In the midst of that is Archibald Lord Rosebery, who's Lord Rothschild's son-in-law. So When you break down who these people are, it's a small coterie of Fabian socialists. These are also the same kind of people that would later fund Hitler. The Fabian socialist English ingsoc element of British society, this elite part that wants world domination. They're very interesting characters. That's just the Pilgrims Society. Just wanted to point that out. We got to get to this Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Remember that guy from 1886 wrote that book, Triumphant Democracy? Look what his foundation's doing by 1908. This comes from testimony of Norman Dodd, who was the research director for the Rees Committee in the 1950s. We'll get to that. But this is what they were saying in 1908. The Carnegie trustees for the Endowment for International Peace, they asked, is there any means known more effective than war, assuming that you wish to alter the life of an entire people? In 1909, the answer is, there is no more effective means than war that exists to humanity. So they say, how do we involve the United States in a war? Well, we must control the State Department. So they set about working on that. That totally happens around that time. British insertions, Anglo-Americans take over the State Department. And from then on, all these other things you see, OSS, CIA, we'll get to it. They're British creations through this means of the world foundations inserting into our society. And then they ask, how do we do that? How do we get United States in a war? We got to take over their State Department. Okay. We must take over and control their diplomatic machinery of the country. And then they resolve the plan to that end. And then they send this telegram to Wilson saying, be sure the war isn't over too quickly. And then in 1919, to prevent a reversion of pre-1914 mentality, pre-war mentality, we must control the education of the United States. Okay. Well, maybe these guys didn't control the education. Maybe they just figured it out, something better to do. But in 1919, this was their plan. Now, ironically, at the same time, you've got this roundtable movement, this group from Cecil Rhodes, Last Will and Testament, that is in the power driving seats of the British Empire. So it's the British Imperial Federation. Instead of an empire, they're going to call it Imperial Federation, later a Commonwealth. And that's coupled with the Rothschild dynasty financing of those operations. Together, they can get America. And implementing the Last Will and Testament of Cecil John Rhodes to get America back into the empire, really, without firing a shot or us even knowing it. It's a brilliant plan. One of the first steps is to get us on a central bank and get us away from any type of Congress having say over coining of money. This can be read in the Secrets of the Federal Reserve by Eustace Mullins, or The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin, or this book, Anthony C. Sutton's The Federal Reserve Conspiracy. I have Sutton in here because I have several other of his books in this presentation. So why not use his book to represent the Federal Reserve Conspiracy, which started on that Jekyll Island place that we talked about a couple minutes ago. At this same time, the Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations are changing education into schooling. So taking away this part where we ask questions and find answers, and getting into how do we control the minds and indoctrinate interchangeable parts that won't ask too many questions and be good little automatons. The famous piece is the Flexner report. Abraham Flexner did this report for the Rockefeller Foundation. They bring in the scientific management principles, and then they change our history to reflect an Anglo-Americanization of our history in like the 1920s. While that's going on, so notice there's many layers going on at once, right at the same time. You've got, according to the Underground History of American Education by John Taylor Gatto, you got in his chapter 9, at the same time that we're talking about, this cult of scientific management, bringing in the measured and scientific application of labor juxtaposed to human beings of Frederick Winslow Taylor, coupling that with the English Fabian socialist, kill them with kindness, let's do what's good for them, pragmatic idea. And they formed what is called by H.G. Wells the open conspiracy. Now, as Gatto is explaining it, part of that is bringing in Prussian schooling into America, changing it from, oh, you have an interest or you have a question, let's find out the answer, to here's what you're supposed to know so you guys can all think, react, and behave nearly identically. They're regulating people's lives like machinery. This is like early applications of cybernetics. The Rockefeller Report of 1916 is kind of what codifies this and kicks it off. And then we're going to see decades of this unfold. But these are the last part of that chapter was the obstacles on the road to centralization. Their goal is central control and a track trace database of every living and non-living asset in this whole place. So it's like the entire enslavement of the entire society. So that's what he's pointing out just in chapter 9 of that one book. But that's what's going on around this time. Now, there's facts to back it up, and Gatto provides quotes like this. New York Mayor Hyland was quoted vividly in the New York Times of March 27th, 1922. The real menace to our republic is this invisible government, which, like a giant octopus, sprawls its slimy length over the cities, state, and nation. It has seized in its tentacles our executive officers, our legislative bodies, our schools, our courts, our newspapers, and every agency created for the public protection. To depart from mere generalizations, let me say that at the head of this octopus are the Rockefeller Standard Oil interests. I think that's an understatement. He's aiming a little too low, but he's on point. Here's another quote from Gatto's chapter 9, Cult of Scientific Management. In the congressional record of January 26, 1917, for instance, Senator Chamberlain of Oregon entered these words: they are moving with military precision all along the line to get control of the education of the children of the land. All right, well, maybe those are just two quotes and they didn't add up to much. Oh, wait, there's more. Senator Poindexter of Washington followed, saying, the cult of Rockefeller, the cult of Carnegie, as much to be guarded against in the education system of this country as a particular religious sect. And in the same issue, Senator Kenyon of Iowa related, there are certain colleges that have sought endowments, and the agent of the Rockefeller Foundation or the General Education Board, which Rockefeller created, had gone out and examined the curriculum of these colleges and compelled certain changes. Forced for certain changes. That's interesting. It seems to me one of the most dangerous things that can go on in a republic is to have an institution of this power apparently try to shape and mold the thought of the young people of this country. Senator Works of California added, these people are attempting to get control of the whole educational work of the country. Paris, 1919 is where World War I ends. And World War I kicks off for us in 1917. For the rest of the world, I think it was 1914. It's called Lord Milner's Second War for a good reason. Lord Milner practiced. He's part of the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable. They have a plan for world domination. They practiced their games down in South Africa on the Boers and creating concentration camps. That was Lord Kitchener. And by the time they get to the Second War, that's World War I. We don't have time to go into the details, but the best documentary I know is the World War I Conspiracy by James Corbett. I do have a small role to play in that, presenting some evidence and artifacts. And the story that's told in there fits perfectly on both sides of what I'm presenting today. So we'll just move past that. Walter Rothschild in the Balfour Declaration, the origin of the First World War. Now, I'm going to read this section. It's on the Rothschild archive. So you guys can go read this for yourself in greater detail. But let's put it like this. Beginning in 1916, the British hoped that in exchange for their support of Zionism, quote, the Jews, end quote, would help to finance the growing expenses of the First World War, which was becoming increasingly burdensome. Sorry, I'm reaching to see the monitor to read this small quote. More importantly, policymakers in the Foreign Office believed that the Jews would be prevailed upon to persuade the United States to join the war. At this time, there were very strong pro-Zionist feelings by many of the political elite and establishment. Many of Britain's leaders, including Prime Minister David Lloyd George and Balfour himself, felt for the Jews and their history. These men were deeply religious Christian Zionists. See, this is what they have in common. We'll talk about this in a second. They had grown up on the Bible. The Holy Land was their spiritual home. They believed that modern Zionism would fulfill a divine promise and resettle the Jews in the land of their ancient fathers. So this is the British Israel World Federation angle. The British royal family draws their power from the Old Testament. Their financiers draw their power from the Old Testament. The rite and initiation, the divine right of kings, all these sort of things came together, and the Christian Zionists who were around at that time saw fit to move forward and they have an exchange. Now, there's an exchange that goes on, and what we know popularly in history is the receipt. We just don't understand what it's a receipt for. In their own words, on this Rothschild archive site, the British wanted America to get into the war. Oh, look, if I had just clicked one more, I had done myself the favor and put it big on screen. Now, April 1917, the United States declares war on Germany and enters World War I. So it's April 6th, I believe, 1917. Later that year, the Balfour Declaration is made. Now, there's 5 drafts of this. I'm going to show you all 5 drafts. And essentially being issued on November 2nd, 1917, this is the final draft. That's a receipt for a transaction of America entering the war on the side of Great Britain, according to what we just learned right here, the origins of the First World War. So moving forward, let's look at this Balfour Declaration and in great detail. Now, recently, it was the 100th anniversary of it. There's a Balfour 100 website that's still up. This is the official website. And you can see here that the Balfour Declaration, oddly enough, because it ends as a statement from the British government giving the Zionists Palestine, but it begins with Lord Rothschild writing, here's what I want. And he sends it off. And Arthur Balfour makes a second draft here, 2nd August, 1917. And then Lord Milner, part of the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable, he makes draft 4 in August 2017. There's also the Milner Amory. Leo Amory was another Cecil Rhodes Roundtable participant. So the people drafting these and making the upgrades for Lord Rothschild are all known. They're all in part of the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable movement. Here's the final draft we get right here. Here's the final wording. Dear Lord Rothschild, I have such pleasure in conveying to you, on behalf of His Majesty's government, the following declaration of sympathy with the Jewish Zionist aspirations, which have been submitted to and approved by the cabinet. So His Majesty's government gives this land that they don't really have. Like, Palestine is not really theirs. They promised it to another group of people. There's a whole lot of funny dealing going on with what's going on, but it's issued, and it's Balfour's most famous declaration, even though there's one from 1926 we're going to see in a minute. Paris 1919, this is the end of Lord Milner's war. So all these things we just discussed went on during World War I. A lot of change, a lot of great reset by these people. This is the Anglo-American powers ruling at the Paris Peace Conference, redrawing the maps to the world, right? Before Versailles, you had these old empires. After, they become new countries with bureaucratic structures in between the people who run them and the people who are being run. It might be for their own preservation. Let's put it that way. After the French Revolution and the guillotine, they wanted to come up with better plans. Here's where we have the rise of the Anglo-American think tanks. These are working groups to manifest the last will and testament of Cecil Rhodes, to bring America back into the empire so they can take over the world. Chatham House is the Royal Institute of International Affairs. It's created first. It's in the mother country. It's over in England. In America, we can't call it Royal Institute, so we call it the Council on Foreign Relations. A council, by the way, is a Soviet. And if you think about 1921, what's going on with council? Oh, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, councils. If you replace the word Soviet with council, you could see it's decision by many, it's collectivism. It's like The Economist. It speaks in a collective voice. It negates, doesn't need the individual unless you're going to be part of their group. So these are the think tanks, the major think tanks created 1919, 1921 sequentially. And around this time in the early 1920s, this is 1926, this is the Third British Empire, being a course of lectures delivered at Columbia University, New York by Alfred Zimmern. Zimmern is one of the Rhodes Roundtable guys. A. B. Zimmern is Carroll Quigley's whistleblower. And then the next part of this is it's going to shock you. He outlines how the empire and United States can't get together, so they're going to have to rebrand this, right? I also noticed here on the middle of the contents, the empire and the non-white peoples. If you want to look for what are the roots of institutionalized racism, you can start here, right there. There's an institution. It is racist. It has a plan for white English-speaking ideas to rule the world by force, not by reason. And they wrote about it. So when people are blaming America for these ideas. Like, we didn't invent these ideas. And some of these ideas are not representative of America that are floating around and being expressed as American ideas. We got to reclaim our free thought. And it starts by looking at what these people actually did. In the lecture of the Third British Empire, he's asking the question, like, how has the British Empire survived? How is this going to survive in the future? Then he talks about the power of the United States and kind of he's on the team of how to get America back into the empire. That's what it's all about. The empire is not the only greatest political community in the world. It's also the most diversified. He goes and makes this whole great case. And this is the rebranding of the empire as the Commonwealth of Nations. So around the time of 1925, the British Empire goes away. And all of a sudden, the Commonwealth of Nations are there, and the Queen's in charge of 54 member states. Remember how the empires went away after Versailles? This is like the same thing for themselves after that conference. So it's no longer an empire. It's not ruling families. It's a Commonwealth. And you guys got governments. And we might have our names and pictures on the money, but we're not really running your countries anymore. That's the gist. This is how they can get America into that special relationship. America can look, our cousins have changed. They're not really empire building on the backs of opium and broken people's lives. They're evolving. And so America became entangled, enthralled through the 1920s, 30s, and 40s into World War II. And this is where we can see the Wall Street and the financiers' hand in all these kind of international machinations. So you've got Anthony C. Sutton's Wall Street trilogy. He wrote Wall Street and FDR, Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler, Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, showing that how these huge national movements were underfunded, like funded under the same financing, the technologies being provided by Western companies that are around that center of financing and where money is being created, that fountain, that spring. It's like a aquifer for money just coming out because they're putting it out of nothing. That went to build. The robber barons used that money in the late 1800s, early 1900s to create railroads and other strategic industrial infrastructure for communism to take hold in the Soviet Union, for communism to take hold in China. The fingerprints of the robber barons that we're talking about are all over the proto movements of those eras. Moving past that, 1939, you get this interesting book. And this is by a Rhodes scholar. This is an acolyte of Cecil Rhodes. It's called Union Now with Britain. And calling on Americans and citizens of the British Commonwealth to begin, while they may, the United States of Man. That sounds a lot like a United Nations, right? So this Rhodes scholar, this person who wants to have America back in the British Empire, this guy named Clarence Strait, he writes this book, 1939. Well, people in America start sniffing this out, ends up in the congressional record by the next year, steps toward a British Union, a world state. You know, there's various parts and pages. So here's the referencing for this Torkelson testimony. But this is one of the earlier artifacts that I had found back in the day. The remarks of Honorable J. Torkelson of, I think he's from Montana. That's in the House of Representatives. So it's like I think it's 40 pages or something like that. So you would want to find the source. You would want to print it out and Sunday, put your glasses on and check it out. Around the same time as this British infiltration into America, the United States goes to war with Japan. Got 3,000. It's like a 9/11 out there in Hawaii because they said 9/11 was like a new Pearl Harbor. So that was like their 9/11 of the day. Now, interestingly enough, the Standard Oil Rockefeller oil depots at Pearl Harbor for all those ships and planes, all that stuff untouched by the Japanese. Just saying. So the United States is at war with Japan. They no one could have foreseen this unless you're British intelligence running the spies who are planning the operation and not telling America at the same time. So John Cecil Masterman was a director of MI6, Military Intelligence Department 6, Section 6 for the Queen, or the King of England at that point. The double cross system in the War of 1939 and 1945 is Masterman's memoir. And in there, he says that they had an agent, that he had this questionnaire. He's working for the Japanese. Pearl Harbor would be the first point attacked, and plans for this attack had reached an advanced state by August 1941. Obviously, so this is MI6. They know all about it. They're running the spies that are doing it in Germany, in Japan. It's fascinating when you read what they wrote. Obviously, this is Masterman quoting. Obviously, it was for the Americans to make their appreciation and to draw their own deductions from the questionnaire rather than for us to do so. Nonetheless, with our fuller knowledge of the case and the man, we ought to have stressed its importance more than we did. With the greater experience of a few more years' work, we should certainly have risked a snub and pointed out to our friends in the United States what the significance of the document might be. But in 1941, we were still a little chary of expressing opinions and a little mistrustful of our own judgment, because they're saying they hadn't been working with American intelligence very long because they had just created the OSS at that point, right? So they didn't want to say, hey, by the way, we're running spies all over the place and you guys are going to be attacked and our guys know about it, because they don't want to let them know the bigger picture. So those 3,000 lives in Japan that were sacrificed because they could have been prevented, it was there to build the special relationship between America and its former enemy, the British Empire. And there you have the admission from the guy who was running MI6 and the spies at the time. It's much more interesting than we have time to go into today. Other books I would recommend. Jeanette Conant is the granddaughter of James Bryant Conant from Harvard, who helped to bring the Prussian education system to America. She wrote a book called The Irregulars, the British spy ring inside wartime Washington. Roald Dahl, who wrote Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Ian Fleming, who wrote Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. These were British spies, like assassination qualified. Can we roll that British spies in America during a time when we were supposed to be friendly with them? They're treating us like a foreign, well, because we are, and we just don't know it. That's kind of the history of the 20th century. One side knows what they're doing. The British Anglo-American Rhodes side, they know exactly what they're doing. The Americans are just like, oh, isn't it nice? We're back with the British and we love their royal family. It's so glitzy. So there's a couple books here that you can dig into that. Along the same time, Victor Rothschild, a member of the famous banking dynasty, was part of the Cambridge 5 spy ring. So he joined MI5 during World War II. He was part of the group with Philby and Blunt and these other guys that formed the spy ring. It was a communist spy ring. And Philby at that time was in charge. He was about to be in charge at MI6. So Philby's dad, St. John Philby, was the predecessor that groomed this whole system that Victor Rothschild walked into with Kim, where they had groomed Arab Nazi proxy forces through the 40s, 50s, 60s. And then Kim Philby sold those off to US CIA to Allen Dulles. And that's where Osama bin Laden, Mujahideen, Al-Qaeda comes from MI6 grooming. Victor Rothschild is called the fifth man. If you look for a book, that's the good book on that history. Now, we have an Anglo-American intelligence community. There's nothing in the United States as far as intelligence community that's not top-down British first. So the guys from MI6, including Ian Fleming, helped to create OSS, the Office of Strategic Services and Central Intelligence Agency. OSS was World War II. CIA comes around in 1947. And you've got this other interesting world group. So the United Nations is international territory inside of New York City. That real estate used to be a slaughterhouse district and was owned by the Rockefeller family. And they also had the Rockefeller family architect create the United Nations and its building. So if you're robber baron enough, maybe you can create an international organization to convince people you're not really gangsters. These people did it 1945. You're a little bit behind if you're going to start. To end the scourge of war, by the way, just a group of people getting together to rule the world. 1947, you got also Clark Clifford's National Security Act. Clark Clifford later in the 1980s was caught in the Bank of Credit and Commerce International scandal, the BCCI scandal. So a guy who's in drug money laundering in the 80s created the National Security Act under which that drug money laundering in the 80s was being done. It's interesting. Full circle for Clark Clifford. There's also the creation of CIA, the creation of the State of Israel, and they needed Nelson Rockefeller's Latin American votes to sway the result in that newly created United Nations to recognize Israel as a state and to reach that Rothschild goal. Was it? Let's see, 30 years. Yeah, 30 years after the Balfour Declaration. Now, remember the guy from the Third British Empire a couple slides ago, 1926 Columbia Lectures? In 1948, Alfred Zimmern, a whistleblower from the Cecil Rhodes Roundtable Group, disclosed the inner workings of the Rhodes, Milner, Lionel Curtis connection at the helm of the British Commonwealth plan for globalism. Quigley was so incredulous that he spent the next 20 years researching the veracity of Alfred Zimmern, the Third British Empire storyline. The result of that study was Quigley's 1966 tome, Tragedy and Hope, A History of the World in Our Time. So Quigley hears Zimmern. He's like, that's crazy. He spends 20 years studying that. He writes Tragedy and Hope. This book on the left, The Anglo-American Establishment, is the actual story. Quigley wouldn't let it be published during his lifetime because he feared for his life. So after he passed away, it was brought to the American public in 1981, interestingly by, I think, Stephen Zarlinga, who wrote The Lost Science of Money. The Anglo-American Establishment is such a dense story that most people don't get it. You have to learn the people that he's talking about in this narrative. When you learn that, you learn why the American flag is in distress, upside down, and greatly outsized by the British Union Jack. There's an Anglo-American establishment. It has maintained power up through the present day. It's not the same people. It's multi-generational now. But the goals they're trying to reach are not limited to a generation. They're big ideological goals about world domination. Around this time in the 50s, you got these non-governmental organizations springing up. And there was an investigation into the un-American activities of these non-governmental organizations. So the United States Congress investigation into nonprofit foundations is called the Reece Committee. The findings of the Reece Committee report in 1954 by Norman Dodd. What it showed was the three major foundations, Rockefeller, Ford, and Carnegie foundations, were engaging in un-American activities, trying to change the attitudes, values, behaviors, and beliefs of Americans so that we would be more in line with what the Soviet system wants, because that's a much better population control than all this frisky freedom over here in America. The leader of the research I mentioned earlier, Norman Dodd, he presided as the research director of the tax-exempt foundations and their comparable organizations investigation. The end quote in the report, he says, and this is very understated if you read the report, but this is how it reads. It seems incredible that the trustees of typically American fortune-created foundations should have permitted them to be used to finance ideas and practices incompatible with the fundamental concepts of our Constitution. Yet, there seems evidence that this may have occurred. So he's trying to appear diffident, but if you look at the information, they definitely did it. They wrote all about it. And they knew no one's really going to read it because they're, too busy listening to the radio, or soon along comes TV. Oh, it's color TV now. Oh, you got movies in your pocket. I mean, how are people supposed to find this interesting with Netflix and Hulu and all these things? So America got away from needing to know its history because they trust what they were told by Walter Cronkite on TV and all these times when people had 4 channels. They really got it on lockdown. Around that same time, speaking of Walter Cronkite, you got this guy come to be president. Now, he's Irish, and his dad was an ambassador to Great Britain, and the British don't like the Irish, none too much. So there are fingerprints all over this man's assassination, which do not lead back to American organizations or mafia or organized crime, though the British government and MI6 works with all those groups. So when you look at it and why those records are still kept secret, you might look across the pond to see what the National Secrets Act or their Official Secrets Act reads, because we're not playing with American anything on that. That was a coup d'etat, and the people that took power are still in power today and driving world events. Around 1966, Carroll Quigley gets Tragedy and Hope, all 1,300 pages out of his head. But that was a great experience. He floats it out there. In there, there's a key couple of areas where you're going to find out very clearly, transparently into the narrative of this story. Here's a couple of those pages. I put them here on the record. He's talking about all the things we just discussed during this. By the 1970s, you've got Bretton Woods, and this is the decoupling of the currency from the gold backing and the transitioning into the petrodollar. The petrodollar is in the hand of the Saudis that were groomed for MI6 by St. John Philby. So we have that in the 70s as changeover of currency. In the 80s, junk bonds and moving American productivity overseas. By the 90s, you get the end of the Cold War and ramp up for Agenda 21. And by the 2000s, Oh, all that Brzezinski's technology, if we only had it in the 1970s, well, by the 2000s, we have it. So where's the information? Now they can collect it, process it. This is the use of command and control over human beings. This is cybernetics, technocracy, mass surveillance, loss of human rights, and the name of security, big brother. And it's all driven by the same people and the same agenda we've been talking about. By 2001, here's the Carnegie Institute for International Peace. These are some of the people who got the Medal of Philanthropy. Some of these people are more famous today than they ever were then. I mean, Ted Turner's still famous, and David Rockefeller, he's famous. And, Bill Gates Sr., he's still famous because his son's somebody out there. I don't know what he does, but I heard he had a kid that's famous. But there's that guy, Tony Fauci. That's interesting. And Brooke Astor, she's part of that Anglo-American establishment. I think she's from the Cliveden set, her family, Astor family, big opium family over there. Anyway, nothing to see there with the elites taking pictures and patting themselves on the back. Let's look at how the elites are going to use big money to solve world poverty. They call it inclusive capitalism. It started in 2014. It was a project of Lynn Forrester to Rothschild, but now that COVID came along, they got a breath of fresh air and new wind. Now they're partnered with the Vatican, as you can see on their logo. And you can find out more about the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation and these other non-governmental robber baron financial empire foundations that are shaping attitudes, values, behaviors, and maybe your digital ID. Whoa, the inclusive capitalism people. Let's make sure we don't get them mixed up because they're so similar. The inclusive capitalism is Rockefeller and Ford. And if we go here, you got our friend Klaus. They're going to fix the human problem. They're the front end for the Club of Rome. By 2030, you'll own nothing and you'll be happy. They have this agenda, this plan for your future. It's not conspiratorial because they're telling you about it. They write about it. The shaping of the fourth industrial revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, COVID-19 and the Great Reset. Klaus has many books. He can tell you all about it. But here's the Commons Pass and the Commons Project, because they're going to do all this digital tracking so, you don't get the COVID. And the Commons Project was funded from the Rockefeller Foundation. Here's their pass. You guys seen the pass? About us. Click it. It goes from COVID PCR. It looks official over here too. Oh, it's them. They, them, those who want to track, trace database, and also ran lockstep exercises to make sure that we accept a common pass, which might be the end goal, the implantation, the indelible mark so that they can track you. So my encouragement to you, stand on the shoulder of giants, any one of them, all of them, and see the future, whether it's Carol Quigley or Anthony Sutton or Charlotte Iserbyt. That book's 700 pages right there. But if you want to learn about the Carnegie Foundation and how they changed American education, it's all in there. The Ultimate History Lesson with John Taylor Gatto is my 5-hour interview with John discussing in depth the history brought forth through his magnum opus, which I think was Underground History of American Education, but also Weapons of Mass Instruction and Dumbing Us Down. He wrote other books that are equally as powerful, just not as lengthy. Can we roll that, the Gatto clip?
Eventually it's fatal to the idea that, the hierarchy must be preserved.
I think that's just a sign that there's so many people in this country, when things can get that obviously irrational, that there's just no intellectual self-defense. There's no one left to form, a sentence, let alone a paragraph, let alone have the power to get it printed in front of millions of people anymore. And that's what I noticed.
And no editor would dare print it anyway for fear the ads would dry up.
Senator Oscar Callaway in 1917 addressed the Congress, and he said that the J.P. Morgan interests, the shipbuilding, powder interests, had all gotten together and bought the top editor. They placed editors at the top 25 newspapers in order to control the content on political policy and military policy. So that was really the declaration, the first origins of the Council on Foreign Relations, which goal is to kind of control and mold the minds of the masses using official experts and historians. And
so these clues won't leak. How about Harry Truman's speech before the U.S. Senate in 1942, denouncing the Rockefeller interests as traitors because they were selling oil to both sides. What he didn't know was that the Krupp cannon makers were doing the same thing, making the German cannon, selling them to the French or anyone else who would buy them. They had already become a virtual global society. But to Truman's denunciation of the Rockefellers on the floor of the Senate, you would think that would be just elementary sharing with generations of school kids. No, doesn't exist for all practical purposes, unless you're willing to sit in the, well, my generation, sit in the library stacks and go through. I did that in Columbia. I said, I'm going to find out. Oh, no, I'm going back to 1958. So I got a stack pass. I've heard about stack pass. I'm down like in the 6th level. There's these huge stacks of popular magazines. He says, I'm interested to find out what the popular newspapers and magazines said about the Second World War before it started. For like the 90 days before it started, let me tell you, to a publication, there not only was a certainty there was going to be war, but no worry at all. They all agreed that there was no ability on the part of any potential enemy to sustain a war, that all the gains would be right away, then they couldn't replace their losses. I noted that Quigley said, not only did the British start the war with a larger air force than the Germans and more advanced technologically, but they could replace their losses and the Germans couldn't, and the Japs couldn't at all. So they ended the war with the same plane they began the war with. Well, this was understood before we had a war. This was a good way to get out of the Depression. Good way to cow dissidents in the population always is to declare a national emergency. Then you have an excuse for foreclosing freedom of speech.
What did Quigley do that was so unique or remarkable that no one else had done before?
Well, what Carroll Quigley, the head of the Foreign Service Department at Georgetown University, no marginal school, what he did was use his invitation to be the only human being ever invited to view the files of the Council on Foreign Relations, and I believe its predecessor also. What he did was to actually write a major piece of nonfiction, must be 1,300 words long, pages long, fairly small print, and he made the fatal mistake of being a superb writer and thinker so that it's accessible to anyone who gets a hold of a copy of the book. That was quite impossible beginning 6 months after the book was published. And I can just see the manuscript must have been this big. So an editor asked to vet the thing and make sure, yeah. And after all, Georgetown, this guy's safe. Out it goes. Macmillan publishes it, sells out instantly. And any conspiracy theory you've ever heard of is documented, only not as a conspiracy theory. Gives you the name, the date, the time, the actual letters. Oh, good God. Well, somebody got hung for that. Macmillan broke the plates, told Quigley there was no interest in the book at all, broke the plates so it couldn't be reprinted. Quigley's on a tape recording right at the end of his life that's stored down in Georgetown in the stacks, saying that they lied to him, that they had tons of who wouldn't want to read the book. I spent 6 months looking for a copy of the book and finally found one in the rare book room at New York University and had it stolen. And then a couple of months later, because I'd looked in so many cities, I got a call, mysterious call, from a fellow I think he turned out to be a dentist, had a radio show.
Who is?
Okay.
It's Stan Monteith.
Yes, Stan Monteith. He said, I understand you're looking for, I said, do you know where? Yes, he said, I have some copies. Of course, he had reprinted the copies. And after Monteith, over the next couple of years, several other people had taken the Macmillan and reprinted it so much, in fact, that it became the basis for a growing number of aware people. They weren't sure what they were aware of, other than that the story was not as delivered, not in junior high and not at Harvard. It was a different story. It was a story that could accommodate two fraternity brothers at Yale running against one another for president. The big agenda. But Quigley's real gift to the rest of us is his absolute mastery of prose and his really interesting mind, and his confession that he agreed with the plot. He simply, as a good Roman Catholic, didn't apply with the secrecy. He said, I believe there's nothing anyone can do about this anyway. It was marvelous. I'd go back whenever I feel despair. And not an easy, it's an easy read because it's so well written, but it's a big chunk. He says, for example, that the only times liberty's ever appeared in human society is when the population is privately armed with deadly weapons. And to reach the acme of liberty, they have to have the same weapons available to them that the government has available to them. And yet we're not talking about some guy who rolls his collar up. We're talking about this internationally famous scholar. So,
well, at the beginning, the American Revolution, the people who were fighting against the British government had equal arms. They were landowners. They had interest to fight over it. That stopped being equal in the 1930s with mechanized warfare and mass production, because they've had Prussian education in place for 80 years. And now everyone's an obedient worker, and Amtssprache allows a lot of people to do things that they normally wouldn't do, but now it's part of their job, and now it's their responsibility, and now it's their duty. And all the things that Milgram drove home through his experiments. Look, these people will kill other people if you put a white coat on.
Yes. Yes. Well, it's quite exciting. It's a hideous turn in human history, but it's quite exciting. The comprehensive surveillance mechanism. What you can do is suppress that activity, but you can't do it and say this is a free society and we're all in the game together.
There are 4 copies, I think, of Tragedy and Hope around. Have you seen the first edition?
I have, and I'm wondering when Macmillan has been forced to reprint it very recently, the last year or two, and I'm wondering, you only have to delete key sections, still be a big book, to take the real sting out of it. I thought somebody with young eyes and a lot of stamina ought to sit with the original edition and the reprint just to make sure.
So we're doing tomorrow afternoon. We have a first edition and we have several other reprints, and we're going to...
Oh, do let me know, because I have other people I'm trying to see the idea, and I could say the project's underway, and why don't you send them a little check? And
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about Quigley's book, Anglo-American Establishment?
Wow. Well, Richard, that was a masterful laying out of the means, motive, and opportunity. And I know for a lot of people, that was a deep dive. I just want you to recognize, I know that talking with Richard is like talking with Nassim. They're used to doing 7-hour lectures. So to condense it down into that amount of time is a tremendous gift. And if you find your attention wanders, know that this is, to have this in our archives, in the Freedom Portal archives, is an absolute treasure, because what you put together makes it so clear who, why, and how. And it takes it completely out of the realm of conspiracy theory. I mean, they laid out the conspiracy.
After 3 decades of work, School Teacher of the Year John Taylor Gatto became an author and blew the whistle on public schooling because it's a form of indoctrination, not true education. After interviewing him for 5 hours in The Ultimate History Lesson, we created the Critical Thinking Trifecta Masterclass to teach the essential learning skills that the system can't afford to teach you. These 3 skills not only protect you from untruths, they turbo boost your ability to learn anything. These skills let you see through manipulation. Learn to think for yourself instead of repeating what you're told. Get the $299 Critical Thinking Trifecta Masterclass now free for a limited time at getautonomy.info.